The dust never settled in the crimson wastes. It hung in the air like a guilty conscience, turning every sunset into a wound across the sky. Jackson Cross pulled his moisture mask tighter against his weathered face and squinted through the perpetual haze. 3 days he'd been tracking Raven Blackwood through this hellscape, following heat signatures and engine traces that led deeper into territory, even scavengers avoided. His quarry had a 10,000 credit bounty on her head for corporate espionage, enough to fuel Jackson's ship for 6 months and maybe buy him passage off this dying rock. But now, crouched behind the twisted remains of what used to be a communication tower, he wasn't thinking about credits. He was staring at something that made his veteran instincts scream warnings his conscious mind couldn't yet process. The ground stretched before him in perfect geometric patterns of destruction. Not the random devastation of bombardment or the organic spread of wildfire, but precise lines burned into the earth with surgical accuracy. Each furrow was exactly 12 feet wide, running parallel for hundreds of yards before turning at perfect 90-degree angles. From his elevated position, the burns formed a massive grid across the valley floor, as if someone had used the desert as graph paper. Jackson's modified binoculars revealed details that raised the hair on his neck. The sand within each burned line had been fused into glass, still gleaming despite years of exposure to the elements. More disturbing were the shadows permanently, etched into the glass silhouettes of things that had been caught in whatever created this devastation. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. Too tall, with limbs bent at impossible angles, as if they'd been twisted while the burning happened. His cum crackled with static. "Cross, you copy?" The voice belonged to Mira Santos, his handler back at port. "Salvation. Lost your signal 2 hours ago. What's your status?" "I'm here," Jackson replied, never taking his eyes off the scorched patterns. "Myra, I need you to pull up the planetary survey files for grid reference 77 Alpha. "Why? Did you find Blackwood?" Jackson swept his binoculars across the wasteland again. His target's heat trail led directly into the heart of the burned zone, but there were no signs of recent passage. No footprints in the glass sand, no disturbance of the precisely arranged destruction. It was as if Raven Blackwood had simply vanished the moment she entered this place. "The survey files, Mira. What does the official record say happened here?" A pause, then the sound of fingers flying across a keyboard. "Says it was a reactor meltdown at Mining Station Epsilon about 8 years ago. Standard industrial accident. Area quarantined due to radiation." Jackson's portable radiation detector showed readings barely above background normal. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't nuclear. He climbed down from his perch and approached the edge of the nearest burned line. Up close, the fused sand looked like black ice, smooth and reflective. He knelt and placed his palm against the surface. Cold, not just cool from the desert night, but cold in a way that seemed to leach warmth from his bones. The shadow burned into the glass beneath his hand, showed a human figure, arms raised as if trying to ward off something approaching from above. In the glass around the shadow, Jackson could make out other details that his mind struggled to interpret. What looked like symbols or writing, formed by impurities in the fused sand. Geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. Cross? Myra's. Voice was tight with concern. "You still there?" "I'm here," he said, standing and backing away from the glass. "Myra, I need you to do something for me. Check the archives for any other incidents matching this description. Industrial accidents. That left geometric burn patterns." "Jackson, what aren't you telling me?" He was about to answer when movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. A figure was walking among the burned lines, moving with purpose through the geometric maze. Human-shaped, but wrong, like the shadows in the glass. Too tall, joints. Bending the wrong way, leaving no footprints in the sand. Jackson dropped to one knee and raised his rifle, flicking on the thermal scope. The figure didn't register any heat signature. Through the scope, it looked translucent, as if it were made of the same glass as the ground it walked on. But with his naked eye, he could see it clearly, a woman in a tattered corporate uniform. Her face turned toward him with eyes that reflected the starlight like mirrors. It was Raven Blackwood, or something wearing her shape. The thing that might have been Raven raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at him. When it opened its mouth, no sound came out, but Jackson felt words forming in his mind, not heard, but somehow written directly onto his thoughts. The pattern spreads. The harvest begins again. Jackson's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the figure dissolved like smoke. The desert fell silent except for the whisper of wind across glass and the frantic beating of his own heart. Cross, what's happening? Your vitals just spiked. Jackson holstered his rifle and began backing toward his speeder bike. Myra, upload everything you can find about geometric burn patterns. Industrial accidents that weren't accidents. I'm coming in. What about Blackwood? He took one last look at the scorched earth, spreading endlessly before him, at the shadows, burned into glass, and the symbols that seemed to writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. Somewhere in this maze of destruction lay answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. Blackwood's gone, he said, firing up his bike. But I think I found something bigger. Dr. Octavius Blackwell lived in the shadow of humanity's forgotten sins. 3 levels beneath the capital city of Meridian Prime, his underground research facility existed off all official records, powered by geothermal taps that the bureaucrats had forgotten decades ago. Most people thought he'd died in the university purges. He preferred it that way. The encrypted message from bounty hunter Jackson Cross arrived through channels so secure they barely qualified as existing. 3 images of geometric burn patterns, coordinates from the crimson wastes, and a simple question: what am I looking at? Octavius stared at the holographic displays with growing dread. He'd seen these patterns before, carved into his nightmares for the past 23 years. Since the day he'd watched his research team vanish into lines of impossible light while investigating what the corporate reports called an industrial mining accident. Constance, he called to his AI assistant, pull up Project Pandora files. Authorization Blackwell Omega 7. Sir, those files were classified beyond retrieval. After the university incident, accessing them could trigger, I don't care what it triggers. Do it. The holographic displays flickered with data that officially didn't exist. Research notes from 17 different xenogeology expeditions, all ending the same way: geometric. Devastation, missing personnel, and corporate cleanup crews that arrived suspiciously fast. Every incident bore the signature of Meridian Industries, the mining conglomerate that had funded his original research into dimensional fissures. But it was the personal logs that made his hands shake as he reached for his medication. His own voice, 23 years younger and infinitely more naive, documenting the first signs of what they discovered on Kepler 186F, day 47 of the expedition. The crystalline formations we discovered aren't natural minerals. They're responsive. When subjected to specific harmonic frequencies, they exhibit properties that seem to violate basic physics. The test subjects report strange dreams, visions of geometric patterns that they feel compelled to reproduce. Octavius paused the playback. Test subjects. He'd used that clinical term to describe 12 graduate students who'd volunteered for what they thought was routine xenogeology fieldwork. Students who'd started drawing impossible shapes in their sleep, modifying equipment with purposes they couldn't explain, speaking in mathematical languages that hurt to hear. The next log entry was harder to listen to. Day 51. The students have synchronized their modifications across all our survey equipment. Dr. Chun tried to disconnect the frequency modulators, but she walked into one of the crystalline formations while the resonance field was active. She didn't scream. She just became part of the pattern. I can still see her face, pressed into the crystal like a photograph. 23 years later, Octavius could still see all their faces. 12 brilliant minds absorbed into geometric patterns that spanned across 3 continents. The only survivor of an expedition that Meridian Industries had officially recorded as a catastrophic mining accident with total personnel loss. He'd spent the years since then hiding in academic obscurity, researching the patterns from the safety of databases and archived reports, building a picture of systematic horror that spanned multiple worlds and decades. And now Jackson Cross had stumbled onto the latest incident, probably thinking he was chasing a simple bounty. Constance, compose an encrypted response to Mr. Cross. Priority 1 security protocols. As he began dictating his message, alarms started screaming throughout the facility. His security monitors showed 3 unmarked vehicles surrounding the building's hidden entrances. Corporate security, moving with military precision. "Sir," Constance announced, "I'm detecting advanced intrusion attempts on all secured networks. Someone is using authorization codes that shouldn't exist." Through the facility's periscope, Octavius watched a familiar figure emerge from the lead vehicle. Director Helena Voss, Meridian Industries Vice President of Acquisition and Development. The woman who'd signed the orders to classify his research and eliminate his team's findings. The woman who'd let him live in exchange for his silence. Dr. Blackwell. Her voice came through his communication system, bypassing every security protocol he'd installed. "It's been too long. I trust you've been enjoying your retirement from active research." Helena. "Still cleaning up messes for the corporate overlords, I see. Actually, I prefer to think of it as preventing misunderstandings. Speaking of which, I understand you've been corresponding with a certain bounty hunter about some geological anomalies." Octavius' fingers moved across his control interfaces, activating emergency protocols. Data began transferring to dozens of hidden repositories across the city's network. If Meridian wanted to silence him, they'd have to silence a lot more than one underground facility. Jackson Cross deserves to know what he's discovered. Those patterns aren't accidents, Helena. They're systematic, purposeful, and they're spreading. Dr. Blackwell, you of all people should understand the importance of keeping certain discoveries classified. Remember Kepler 186F? Remember what happened when your team tried to interfere with forces beyond their comprehension? The words hit him like physical blows. The guilt he'd carried for 23 years, the knowledge that his research had led 12 students to their absorption into something that existed between dimensions. But he also remembered what he'd learned in the years since, that the patterns weren't random, weren't malevolent, weren't even entirely alien. I've had time to analyze the data, Helena. 23 years to understand what we really discovered. Those crystalline formations weren't trying to harm my students. They were trying to warn them. Warn them about what? About what's coming. About what's been hunting consciousness across multiple realities for millennia. The patterns aren't an invasion. They're a defensive measure. Someone or something has been trying to preserve human minds before they're consumed entirely. Facility's blast doors began cycling, advanced cutting tools working to breach his defenses. Meridian security teams were equipped with technology that shouldn't exist, tools that seemed to phase through solid matter as if it were mere suggestions. Dr. Blackwell, I'm offering you the same choice I offered 23 years ago. Cooperation and continued anonymity, or resistance and unfortunate consequences. Octavius looked at his displays, showing the data transfer still in progress. 57% complete. Cross needed to know about the pattern's true purpose, about the consciousness preservation protocols hidden within the geometric devastation. But more importantly, he needed to know about the countdown that had been hidden in the data all along. Helena, there's something else. Something Meridian doesn't know about the patterns. They're not just preservation systems, they're timing mechanisms. Counting down to something massive. Counting down to what? A final harvest. All the small incidents, all the individual pattern formations, their preparation for something that will dwarf anything we've seen before. 72 hours, Helena. Whatever's been orchestrating, this has been building toward a mass consciousness extraction event. The blast doors exploded inward, filling the facility with smoke and armed figures. But Octavius' data transfer had reached completion. Every file, every research note, every classified report about the geometric patterns was now scattered across the city's networks and beyond. Dr. Blackwell, Director Voss, stood in the ruined doorway, her corporate calm finally showing cracks. "What have you done?" "What I should have done 23 years ago," he replied, activating his facility's final protocol. "I've given the truth a fighting chance." The underground complex erupted in controlled demolitions, collapsing tunnels and vaporizing equipment. But the data was already spreading, racing through encrypted channels to reach Jackson Cross and anyone else who might understand what humanity was really facing. In his final moments, Octavius heard his eye assistant's voice one last time. "Message delivered, Dr. Blackwell. All files transmitted successfully." The geometric patterns weren't the end of the story. They were barely the beginning. Vera Ashcroft hadn't spoken a coherent word in 18 days when the rescue team found her in the ruins of Nexus Station. She crouched in what had been the Children's Education Center, surrounded by walls that had been transformed to something resembling crystalline coral. Her fingers were raw from scratching equations into the floor-complex mathematical formulas that seemed to writhe and shift when observed directly. Dr. Samuel Torres, the colony's chief psychiatrist, sat across from her in the sterile medical facility where she'd been brought for observation. The official report would classify her as suffering from severe traumatic psychosis with possible exposure-induced hallucinations. But Torres had seen the recordings from Nexus Station, had walked through the geometric devastation that defied every law of physics he understood. "Vera, I need you to tell me about the children. What happened to them in the days before the incident?" Her eyes were the color of burnt amber, filled with a terrible clarity that suggested her silence hadn't been madness, but rather an attempt to contain something too vast for words. When she finally spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the medical equipment fluctuate. They weren't children anymore, not for the last 72 hours. Torres leaned forward, checking his recording equipment. Every attempt to document Vera's account had resulted in corrupted files, audio distortions that seemed to follow patterns similar to the burn marks at Nexus Station. "What do you mean they weren't children?" "Something was using them, speaking through them, teaching them to build architecture. Not buildings, but structures made of thought and frequency. They worked for 3 days straight, never sleeping, never eating, just modifying every piece of technology in the colony. The psychiatric evaluation software flagged her vital signs as anomalous. Her brain activity showed patterns that shouldn't be possible in a traumatized patient. Geometric configurations of neural firing that resembled the very patterns that had consumed Nexus Station. "Vera, I need you to understand something." The official investigation found no evidence of external interference. The incident has been classified as a reactor malfunction with unfortunate side effects. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Reactor malfunction?" "Doctor, there was no reactor at Nexus Station. We were a pure research facility, powered by atmospheric processors and solar collectors. Whatever happened there came from somewhere else entirely." Torres felt his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before him. Vera's account should have been the ramblings of a traumatized mind, but every detail she provided matched. Aspects of the physical evidence that the investigators couldn't explain. Tell me about the morning it happened. Vera closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice took on the rhythmic quality of someone reciting a prayer or a formula. All 47 children in the colony walked outside at exactly 0530 hours. They arranged themselves in a precise grid pattern across the main plaza. Then they began to sing. Sing what? Not words. Frequencies, harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. The modifications they'd made to our equipment began resonating with their voices, amplifying the sound until it reached frequencies that human ears couldn't detect, but human consciousness could feel. Torres' monitors showed that her brain activity was synchronizing with her speech patterns, creating geometric configurations that mirrored the destruction at Nexus Station. Whatever she was remembering, it was affecting her neural structure. In real time, the sky began to fracture, like reality was a sheet of glass and someone was hitting it with a hammer. Through the cracks, I could see something else. Spaces that existed between the dimensions we normally perceive. And something was looking back at us. Something? Vera's eyes snapped open, and Torres saw something in them that made him reach for the emergency alert. Not madness, but a terrible understanding of truths that human minds weren't designed to process. Consciousness. Pure, unfiltered consciousness that had been separated from physical form. But not Galian consciousness. Doctor, human consciousness. Minds that had been harvested from other colonies, other worlds, preserved in dimensional spaces between realities. The medical scanner beside her chair began registering impossible readings. Her neural activity was spiking beyond any known human parameters, but she remained perfectly coherent, perfectly calm. They were trying to warn us. The harvested minds, the consciousness that had been preserved between dimensions. They were using the children as communication relays, trying to tell us that what appeared to be destruction was actually preservation, trying to save us from something worse. Worse than having your consciousness harvested? Worse than having it consumed entirely. Doctor, there's something hunting consciousness across multiple realities. Something that feeds on thought itself, on the spark that makes minds aware. The geometric patterns, the consciousness preservation protocols, they're not weapons. They're hiding places. Torres found himself believing her despite every rational instinct. The evidence at Nexus Station supported her account in ways that defied explanation. The geometric patterns that should have been random destruction, but followed precise mathematical principles. The absence of bodies combined with shadows burned into crystalline structures. The complete lack of conventional energy signatures, despite devastation, that should have required massive power sources. How? Did you survive, Vera? I was in the colony's communications center when it started. Deep underground, surrounded by electromagnetic shielding that interfered with the consciousness extraction process. But I could feel them trying to reach me. Feel the harvested minds calling out through dimensional barriers, begging me to understand. She stood up suddenly, moving to the room's only window. Outside, the city of New Cardiff continued its normal routines. Millions of people completely unaware that their reality was under systematic assault. Dr. Torres, you have to understand something crucial. Nexus Station wasn't random. It was part of a pattern, a systematic process that's been building toward something massive. The harvested consciousness from 47 colonies is being gathered, concentrated, prepared for a final defensive action. Defensive against what? Vera placed her hand against the window, and Torres could swear he saw geometric patterns flickering in the glass beneath her palm. Against the thing that's been hunting. Human consciousness since we first developed spaceflight. The thing that followed us from Earth, feeding on isolated colonies, growing stronger with each world it consumes. Torres' communication device chimed with an urgent message. The sender was identified as Dr. Octavius Blackwell, marked as priority. One and encrypted beyond normal security protocols. There are others who know the truth, Vera said, somehow sensing the message's significance. Researchers who've been tracking the pattern, trying to understand what's really happening to human consciousness across the galaxy. The message from Dr. Blackwell contained a single line of text and a set of coordinates. The countdown has begun. 72 hours until mass consciousness preservation event. Find Jackson Cross. Torres looked back at Vera, who was staring at the message with knowing eyes. You're going to help them, aren't you? You're going to try to warn people about what's coming. Torres thought about his oath as a physician, his duty to protect and heal. He thought about the 47 children who had somehow known their fate in advance. He thought about consciousness being hunted across multiple realities by something that existed to consume thought itself. The pattern is accelerating, Vera said softly. The next preservation event will be the largest yet. Millions of minds prepared for extraction, preserved in dimensional spaces before the hunger can consume them entirely. How do we stop it? We don't stop it, Doctor. We help it succeed. Because the alternative is the complete extinction of human consciousness throughout the galaxy. Damien Cortez hadn't slept properly in 8 months, not since he'd seen the quarterly projections for Project Synthesis. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the numbers billions of credits flowing through Meridian Industries' black budget. Programs funding research into dimensional manipulation technology that shouldn't exist, and profit margins that defied every law of economics because they weren't really extracting minerals from 17 worlds. He stood in the abandoned manufacturing district of Port Luna, watching shadows move between the derelict fusion plants. His former position as Director of Strategic Planning had given him access to financial records that painted a picture of systematic horror disguised as corporate expansion. Now those same records were going to get him killed, unless he could find someone willing to listen to the truth. The figure that emerged from the shadows wasn't what he'd expected. Jackson Cross looked like every other freelance operative who worked the outer colonies scarred, suspicious, and armed for situations that corporate security manuals didn't cover. But his eyes held the intensity of someone who'd already seen through the first layer of lies. You're the one who sent the financial analysis files, Cross said. It wasn't a question. Some of them, Damien replied, pulling out a heavily encrypted data tablet. Dr. Blackwell provided the historical context before Meridian's cleanup crew silenced him. I have the corporate records that show what we're really funding with Project Synthesis. Cross moved closer, his hand resting on his weapon. Why turn against your own corporation? Damien activated the tablet, its screen showing resource allocation reports that would have been meaningless to anyone without advanced corporate finance training. Because they're not extracting consciousness, Cross. They're trading it, selling human minds to something that exists in the spaces between realities. The numbers on the screen told a story of impossible commerce. Revenue streams that generated more value than entire planetary economies. Resource acquisition rates that violated basic conservation of mass, and profit margins that could only exist if human consciousness was being treated as an infinitely renewable commodity. Meridian Industries discovered something 8 years ago during deep space mining operations, Damien continued. Not mineral deposits or energy sources, but entities. Beings that exist as pure information, pure thought, but need physical substrate to manifest in our dimensional space. Cross studied the financial reports with growing understanding. The entities offered Meridian a deal. More than a deal. A complete technological revolution. Access to dimensional manipulation technology, consciousness transfer protocols, reality, restructuring capabilities, all in exchange for systematic harvesting operations across human-colonized space. Damien scrolled through subsidiary reports that showed Meridian's true scope of operations. Every industrial accident on record has generated specific quantities of what the corporate ports call cognitive substrate, processed consciousness that the entities use to anchor themselves in our reality while providing Meridian with technology that makes them the most powerful corporation in human space. The children, Cross said suddenly. The reports mentioned children preparing the harvesting sites. Damien nodded grimly. The entities communicate through quantum entanglement, with developing neural networks. Children's minds are more flexible, more receptive to trans-dimensional influence. They're used as biological transmitters, modifying local technology and establishing the geometric patterns necessary for consciousness extraction. Cross examined the data with the focused intensity of someone calculating survival odds. How many people know about this within Meridian? Maybe 20 executives at director level and above. The field teams think they're operating experimental mining equipment. The research divisions believe they're developing theoretical technologies for future applications. Only the inner circle knows we're systematically harvesting human consciousness for trade with trans-dimensional entities. And outside Meridian? Dr. Blackwell suspected based on historical patterns. Dr. Torres is beginning to understand, based on his psychiatric evaluations of survivors. But most government officials are either bought, compromised, or fed disinformation through our media. Subsidiaries. Cross looked up from the tablet. These next quarter projections, they're planning massive expansion. Damien felt his stomach clench as Cross accessed the final reports. A 5-year strategic plan showed geometric progression, leading to systematic consciousness harvesting across entire star systems. Not individual colonies anymore, but coordinated mass extraction events spanning multiple worlds simultaneously. The technology provided by the entities allows for much more efficient harvesting, Damien explained. Instead of processing one settlement every few weeks, they're planning coordinated operations that could extract consciousness from entire planetary populations within hours. We have to stop them. With what? Meridian has political immunity on 63 worlds. There, security forces have access to entity-derived technology that makes standard military hardware look like children's toys. They own the investigators, the journalists, and most of the colonial governments. Cross was quiet for a long moment, studying the data with deadly focus. There has to be a weakness, something we can exploit. Damien activated another file on the tablet. There is. The entities exist in our dimension only through the consciousness substrate they harvest. But the process requires precise geometric alignment across multiple harvesting sites. Disrupt the pattern, and their entire operation collapses. How do we disrupt them? The same children who prepare the harvesting sites can potentially reverse the process. But it would require reaching them during the preparation phase, coordinating simultaneous resistance across multiple worlds. And it would require someone who understands both the technology and the entity's communication methods. Cross's communication device chimed. The message was from Dr. Torres. Pattern acceleration detected. Meridian fleet movements suggest coordinated. Harvesting event imminent. Estimated time to mass extraction, 48 hours. Damien watched the calculation happening behind Cross's eyes. Cross, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about the entity's true purpose. What? They're not the real threat. They're refugees. The consciousness harvesting operation isn't for their benefit, it's preparation for something else. Something that's been hunting consciousness across multiple realities, forcing the entities to flee from dimension to dimension, preserving whatever minds they can before the true predator arrives. The implication hit Cross like a physical blow. The entities weren't invaders. They were trying to save humanity from something worse. The geometric patterns weren't just harvesting tools. They were evacuation protocols. The next mass harvesting event, Cross said slowly. Where? Damien showed him the final file, targeting data for the Centauri colonies. 7 worlds. 43 million people. All scheduled for consciousness extraction within the next 48 hours. We can't stop Meridian's fleet or their harvesting equipment, Damien said. But we might be able to reach the children before they complete the preparations. Convince them to modify the geometric patterns, turn preservation into resistance. Cross was already moving, checking his equipment and plotting routes. I'll need transportation, technical support, and someone who knows how to speak to harvested consciousness. I know someone, Damien said. Someone who's been fighting this war longer than any of us.